My name's Lindsay Fischer, and I am a survivor of domestic violence. In 2007, I met a man who seemingly was everything that I possibly could have ever wanted. I had a house, I had just bought a car, I was fairly successful for just coming out of college, and he was what I was looking for. So our relationship started just like a normal relationship. He was charming, he was successful. He was an ex-collegiate athlete, and so I didn't see any warning signs up front. It took about 6 months of our relationship before he became before there were any signs of physical abuse or abuse in general. And that's when he started trying to alienate me from my friends and family and pull me away from them. So asking me to stop going to my girlfriend dinner that we would go to once a week, because he would claim that he wanted to spend that time with me so that he could work at some other point. He started that sort of cycle, and he really pushed me to pursue my dream of writing. And so at the end of that school year, I actually quit teaching to become a writer, and I started writing for his company. So he was covering my salary completely so that it wasn't a jump for me, it wasn't a leap. What happened after that is that he knew that he had some sort of control. And so that's when the physical violence started. It was painful. And I would say that went on for quite a while. There were a couple of times where he would become physically combative with me and always come back with an apology. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to, or I'm sorry, I wasn't taking my meds. He always had an excuse. There was something going on. Work was stressful. And so, again, as somebody who has just sort of taken on this new life, who doesn't have an income outside of him, who loves him because this man that I fell in love with has now changed entirely, I'm wondering what I did wrong. And so at about October, we actually ended up splitting up for a little bit because I was just done. I had called the police. At one point, it was the worst episode I had ever seen with him, and he had actually called the police right before me and told them that I was off of my medication and I was bipolar, and so I was going crazy. And so when the police got to the house, they heard his side of the story, and then they see me in a state of trauma. So who are they going to believe? I tried to pick up and move on, but the trauma was still there. I was still trying to figure out how I contributed to that relationship. And a couple months later, he came back and told me that he had cancer. And so he was asking me to watch his kids, who I haven't mentioned yet, but he did have 2 children that lived with us. And so through that, he rebuilt a connection. He was Prince Charming again. He was sick. He didn't know how severe it was yet. And so he really played this up and then begged me to get back together with him and told me that he would go to therapy. And so we actually started going to couples therapy, somebody that he chose, of course. And I would say it was probably 3 months after we officially got back together that he started being abusive again. I was in that relationship for 18 total months. And at the end, within the last week that I was with him, he told me one day that he loved me so much that he could kill me, and he put a gun to my head. And then the final day that I was there, he threw me down a flight of stairs, and that was when I knew that he was potentially going to kill me. So I left. The recovery process was incredibly difficult. One of the most difficult things that I've ever done in my entire life. And when I left, I went home to my house. I didn't have electricity. 3 days later, my car was repossessed, and a week after that, my house went into foreclosure proceedings. So I was unemployed, I didn't have a vehicle, and I was losing my house at the age of 27. That's an incredibly humbling thing for anyone to go through, but for me, having been so independent previous to him, it was literally like I was standing in the front yard watching the debris fall and unable to fix it. I did my best to cope on my own, and I didn't know that there were services available. So I threw myself back into work, and I got a part-time job, and then I started really wanting to go back into teaching. In about November, I asked my previous employer if she would write me a letter of recommendation so that I could start applying for teaching jobs the next year. And I was actually fortunate enough, in coincidence or fate or whatever you want to call it, she actually had a position open for that January. So I left him in July, and by that following January, I was back in the classroom. I would say that's when I started to really realize that something was off, that I was not healing. Because although I was putting these pieces of my life back together, mentally and physically, I was not okay. I would be in the classroom with students, freshmen, or even my 17-year-olds, they were probably scarier, but the football players would come up and ask me for help. And I would back myself against a wall to make sure that they couldn't come up behind me. And I put tape around my desk to make sure that nobody was getting close to me. And those were not behaviors that I had when I was teaching the first time. So when that happened, I started to realize that I needed some sort of outlet, that something was going on. So without knowing that there were nonprofits for domestic violence survivors, I started blogging. And so my blog was a way for me to sort of voice exactly what was going on in my head that I couldn't share with many people because nobody understood. Fortunately for me, somebody found my blog and then recommended that I start looking for a nonprofit. So I did find one, but that was about a year and a half after I left. And then the waiting list to get in to be seen was 6 months. They didn't have enough therapists to get everyone in. And so I sat on a waiting list for 6 months. So I was out of the relationship for 2 years before I got in to see anyone. For me, I just got to a place where I knew that I couldn't handle it on my own, that I had post-traumatic stress disorder that was just going crazy, and I had body dysmorphic disorder. I didn't even know who I was anymore. And so there were so many things that were going on that I didn't feel like I had another place. And so if somebody is going through that, I want them to know that there are services available and that finding those can help you recover, maybe not quicker, but in a more whole way. I was in trauma therapy for 3 years, and my relationship was only 18 months long. And it took a long time for me to sort of come to terms with, number one, what happened, and number two, how to recover and sort of live afterwards. And I just graduated last July. So it's been an incredible journey, one I could not have done on my own. And there is no shame in reaching out for help. In fact, shame only exists when we don't talk about what happened to us. And so if you can give yourself a voice, even in the privacy of an office, or to look for a shelter, to be able to have somewhere where you feel safe and secure and to have an outlet is critical for recovery. One of the things that I really want people to know in general, not just survivors, is that there is life after abuse, that it goes on, and through that healing process, I've come out stronger than I probably was previous to my relationship. My life is kind, and I'm supported, and it's everything that I've ever wanted right now, which is amazing. And I couldn't ask for anything else. And I know that receiving the services that I did is why I'm able to have this conversation, but also to lead the life that I do.